Another Friday means another episode of Masters of the Air, and this week gave us part 7 to get right into. Following last week's episode where we saw 3 different perspectives taking place, Rosie in the Flak House, Croz in Oxford, and Bucky navigating through Germany. This week we were only split amongst the two, following Bucky being reunited with Buck in Stalag Luft 3 and everything that was happening at Thorpe Abbotts. With this episode touching on Black Monday, the Great Escape, and Robert Rosenthal's legendary heroic mindset, let's jump into this episode and break down all that there was to take away from it. Here is Masters of the Air Episode 7 Ending Explained. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. Let's start by looking at Buck and Bucky at Stalag Luft 3. A large part of the story in this week's episode was set in Stalag Luft 3, the prisoner of war camp that Bucky was taken to at the end of the previous episode. This was a prisoner of war camp which was run by the German Luftwaffe. This was because the Germans had a setup where each branch of the military was essentially responsible for the prisoners of war for the equivalent branches. So this is why they were leading this camp. There was a moment in the opening part of this section where one of the prisoners was trying to lure a cat out from underneath one of the huts. What I found interesting about this was the fact that the camp that was so heavily guarded and where all of the men wanted to find a way to escape somehow managed to attract a cat in there which was able to get in so easily. I don't know if it was intended for that reason, but an innocent cat just somehow finding its way in there and getting in easily just made me think of that and the total contrast. Buck had been listening to a radio where they were able to keep up with the news which was going on with regards to the war, and they were hearing of certain updates that were taking place such as Burma and around the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, and also the British and Allied troops fighting in Italy. This was the Battle of Monte Cassino, which is also known as the Battle for Rome, which consisted of 4 separate battles. We saw the mindset of the German guards and the harsh, inhumane authority that they waved over the prisoners, doing raids, checks, and keeping everybody in line. We saw them shoot Harry for no apparent reason, and we also saw them let dogs on prisoners if they felt they were stepping out of line. There was also a small moment where the guard called out Solomon and questioned if his name was Jewish, something which feels like it's going to be tied into the next episode following the events of the Great Escape, but even if it's not, it just showed what that guard was thinking at that specific moment inside of his head. During a check one night, Buck had his radio discovered, but the German guards weren't aware what it was as they didn't find the headphones that accompanied it, which was almost like a saving grace. I imagine if they did work out what it was, then there would have been severe repercussions for Buck and the members that were inside of the hut. With it being confiscated, Buck wanted to create his own crystal radio where he'd still be able to keep up to date with the news, and due to him having made one when he was younger, he felt like he had the skills to be able to, something which we saw him complete. During the time in Stalag Luft 3, there was a moment where we saw the bombs from the 100th bomb group being dropped and Buck and Bucky being on the ground where they could hear them going off, rather than up in the air dropping them. The only other perspective we've seen them have, so it was a moment that I thought showed the stark contrast of where they now were. The mindset of Buck and Bucky was something which was different, as it always has been. Even though they're the closest of friends, they're very different people as was depicted in the very first episode. Hey, even the fact that one is more tied down with their girlfriend, receives letters, and doesn't take as many risks shows the difference between the pair. And the difference was also clear when Bucky mentioned how he wanted to try to escape the camp once the weather got better. However, Buck didn't share that same mindset and thought it was essentially a death wish, as he thought there was around a 50-1 chance of being able to make it out alive by even attempting that. However, we saw their mindset change towards the end when they heard about the Great Escape and that they felt as though they missed an opportunity to try and leave when all of the guards were out looking for the 76 men that escaped as part of the plan. The Great Escape is a plan that was created which was a year in the making by Royal Air Force Squadron leader Roger Bushell. The plan was to build 3 tunnels named Tom, Dick and Harry where they'd escape through. The word tunnel was something which was never to be mentioned, and they were only to be referred to as Tom, Dick and Harry, as if somebody said the word tunnel, they'd be court-martialed. The tunnels were around 30 feet below the surface, and prisoners would dump the sand that they'd get from digging in the camp until it became impossible to hide it anymore. Apparently, the Germans were aware that something was going on, but they weren't able to discover what. Due to their suspicions, they transferred out 19 people of interest to Stalag 8C. When it came to the actual escape, 76 people participated, and out of those 76, 73 were recaptured. It was initially ordered that all of the recaptured prisoners were to be executed. But a change of approach was decided due to the fear of German prisoners in Allied camps potentially meeting a similar fate as a repercussion. So instead, they executed 50 of them, something which is just horrific, and I feel they captured the shock within the episode. The wide eyes and disbelief at what they heard was just haunting. The 3 people that managed to escape were Per Bergsland, a Norwegian pilot, Jens Muller, another Norwegian pilot, and Bram van der Stok, who was a Dutch pilot. Bergsland and Muller escaped together and made it to Sweden by train with the help of Swedish sailors, and van der Stok travelled through a lot of occupied Europe with the help of the French resistance before reaching a safe haven in Spain. Within the show, we also saw that it was ordered that an inventory of all Jewish prisoners of war at Stalag Luft 3 were to be done. At this point, somber music kicked into gear in the background, and the lieutenant colonel said how it was only Americans at Stalag Luft 3, just Americans. Due to the Great Escape being attempted, the control of the camp was looking like it was going to be taken out the hands of the Luftwaffe. It said that life in the camp was a lot tougher following the events of the Great Escape, as there were more on-the-spot searches and disruption that would be present. The last we saw of Buck and Bucky was them walking out of the office and saying how their odds of getting home alive were even lower compared to what they were at the start of the episode, the time where they were hypothetically speaking about making an escape. With stricter rules coming into place, the dynamic in the prisoner of war camp is probably going to be changing, and I think that will get touched on in the next episode. Spending time with Buck and Bucky was very bittersweet. It was so good seeing them reunited on screen together because you can really sense the chemistry between them as true brothers and the best of friends. But being in that environment, you could just feel the unspoken fear that was there and the understanding of not knowing what was around the corner. Buck asked Bucky to be his best man when they return home due to him asking Marge to marry her. It's good to see them back together and I hope to see more of them in the final 2 episodes. I can't actually believe there's only 2 episodes left. Now let's visit the story at Thorpe Abbotts. The rest of the episode was spent at Thorpe Abbotts and up in the air with Rosie as he was about to go on his 25th mission. It felt like a distaste had started to grow between the members of the 100th Bomb Group and the higher-ups due to the fact that the casualties were getting higher amongst the men that were going up in the air, as it felt like less and less were returning. More new recruits were coming in, which inevitably meant that they were replacing the large amount of death that was present with more new recruits, which then meant more new casualties, so it was just like a repeating cycle. Rosenthal, however, was somebody who had quite a strong mindset and was showing the new recruits the ropes and getting them to settle in to the best of their ability. One thing that I was surprised to see in this episode was that Quinn and Bailey were back at the base. The last we saw of them was in episode 4 when Quinn looked panicked as they arrived in Paris, but we saw that they both made it back safely. I'm not gonna lie, it feels like there was a story fleshed out where we'd follow them, but maybe it just got canned, which is a shame because I was looking forward to picking back up with them and following them on their journey back home and seeing that perspective, as we didn't really get to see that. With them being back at the base, that meant that they never had to go up in the air again. There was a rule in place where if a shot-down crew made it back, they didn't need to go back up again due to the information that they knew about the resistance, passageways back, and the danger it would put not only them in, but the people that helped them. We saw that the missions were going deeper into Germany and the 100th Bomb Group was now above Berlin and dropping bombs there. However, it was proving to be costly in terms of the lives of the men. On Black Monday, March the 6th, 1944, 15 planes went down on the mission to Berlin and 150 men were lost. In a clip in the episode that accompanied Cross giving the voiceover, we saw sheer chaos that was on the runway when the men were returning. Even the men that were making it back and surviving were having injuries that were leaving them in a way which meant that they didn't resemble themselves in a physical or mental state. Dave Miner was on 24 missions, the same amount as Rosenthal, but he was lost in the events that we saw on screen, showing that even when you're close to reaching that number of 25, which allowed you to return home, one mission is genuinely the difference between life and death. That's why after when Rosenthal hit 25 and the higher-ups changed the requirements to 28 for existing men, but 30 for new recruits, there was uproar and anger, because what was once a finish line now became a number that was extremely hard to reach, and by pushing it to 30, it made the men feel like they were almost just being ordered to die up there, because 30 felt like an impossible number of missions to be able to come back from. There was a moment in this episode where we saw Rosie going up on that 25th mission, and we saw the sheer amount of chaos that was present in the air. Planes flying everywhere, firing at all angles, and it just looked like an obstacle course in the sky and a fight for survival. It really reinforced the danger that these men put themselves in, and honestly, I don't know how it would even be possible to navigate the air like that when all of that was going on. When Rosie came back and he was being paraded around and getting cheered, there was something in that. We've seen so many people getting killed off, shot down, and not returning. But seeing somebody that we've grown with whilst watching reach that milestone number and come back alive, it was quite emotional. Emotional because we've not seen that with any character that we followed, showing just how good of a pilot Rosenthal was. With the ballpark being changed, we saw that Rosenthal wasn't prepared to go home and leave the men to go up and risk their lives whilst he was in Florida. In the previous episode, it was mentioned how he felt a responsibility to go up there and help the people that were being oppressed and couldn't fight for themselves. So it always felt like he was going to stick around. However, Lieutenant Colonel Bennett said how the plan was changing. Bombing Berlin wasn't enough anymore. They wanted to shift their plans to take out the entire Luftwaffe and have complete air superiority, which meant using the bombers as bait, something which I imagine is going to come with a lot of casualties again. It's going to be interesting seeing the men's response to the change in plan and them being viewed as bait when the plan gets unveiled in the next episode, because I imagine there's going to be men that are going to feel reluctant to go up. We also saw in this instance that Rosenthal was promoted to CO of the 350th, showing that he was being rewarded for his bravery and the fact that he was prepared to re-up when he had the opportunity to go home. As well as following Rosenthal, we saw Crosby struggling to deal with the sheer amount of death that was present at Thorpe Abbotts, and the constant incoming of new recruits to only then be replaced by more new recruits when they go up and repeat the same mission where many casualties get made. His way of getting a distraction was by meeting with Sandra, the person we were introduced to last week when Harry was in Oxford, and it also looks like we're going to be learning more about her next week as she got a large feature in the trailer. Harry obviously has a wife back home, but Sandra has taken his interest massively, something which it felt like initially started last week, so I'm intrigued to see where that story is going to be going. Overall review. I thought this was a really good episode of the show. Masters of the Air has never failed to deliver in the 7-episode run that it's had so far. I'm just gutted that there's only 2 episodes left, as it feels like this is something that I could just keep on watching. It was the same with Band of Brothers. Buck, Bucky, Harry and Rosenthal have stolen the show, and seeing each of their individual perspectives, it's just a pure pleasure to watch. All of the performances feel respectful, well handled, and they're performed in a way where it feels like a real person, as it should be. I know this show has been compared to Band of Brothers quite a lot, as you'd expect it to be, and whilst it probably doesn't feel quite the same as Band of Brothers, I think that's intentional. We're not spending the same amount of time with the same group of people all together and going through the exact same thing. We're spending a bit of time here and a bit of time there with different characters that are all spread out. And what I think this show has done really well and respectfully is got across the sheer amount of loss that was present amongst the 100th bomb group. Characters from the first couple of episodes are like a memory now, and I imagine that's what it must have been like for the men that were actually there. They were just a memory after a while. Like I said, I can't believe there's only 2 episodes left, but if it's anything like the final 2 episodes of Band of Brothers, I think we could be onto some of the best episodes in the season. At least that's what I'm hoping for. It's been a great show so far, so let's just hope it continues to deliver as it hits the finish line. So, there you have it, Masters of the Air Episode 7 Ending Explained. If you want to see more videos on Masters of the Air, then click on the card in the top corner. There's a playlist for every episode broken down. I've also started breaking down Band of Brothers, so be sure to watch that too if you enjoy this. Thanks for tuning into the video. I'll be breaking down the trailer for Episode 8 and I'll have that out tomorrow, so I'll see you in the next one.